This is February 14th, 1994, Valentine's Day, and we're back at Don's again, and we had more things to finish up in Kansas before we get this family moved to Colorado. So we're going to reminisce a little bit more of some Kansas memories before we move on, and we're ready to go again.
I wanted to start off by saying that we used to have some very wonderful Christmases at our grandparents'. The whole family, Uncle Clarence's and Uncle Harv's and Uncle Glenn's, see who else was uncles in there. Clarence's. We all go up to grandfather's for Christmas dinner, and then they had a Christmas tree set up in the big parlor or the front room, and we weren't allowed in there until after we had had Christmas dinner, and then we'd go in and have our Christmas. The thing about it was, even though it was a 10-cent gift, everybody exchanged gifts, and it made it real nice because even if it was a pencil or something like that, why, it still was a gift, and everybody did enjoy the gift, and so we had good times that way. And then Evelyn wants to point out some things, I think, about grandfather, some of his abilities outside of farming.
Well, I want to say one more thing about that Christmas. Do you remember that they just had the heating stove in the dining room, so that room in there where we had our Christmas tree was cold as ice. Plus they had it all shut up all morning so we couldn't peek in there and see it. So when we were ready to go in there to have our gifts, it would be so cold, but Grandma had one of those little kerosene oil burner things, and I can remember the smell of that little old burner yet. They're trying to set that in there and heat that room up a little bit. Do you remember that?
I remember.
That
Can I say something while you're on that?
All right.
I'd like to mention Aunt Gladys, because Don and I used to go to Aunt Gladys's a lot before Christmas and go to church, and we'd go down there and get peanuts and popcorn and whatever.
Oh, you mean
Candy,
the treats at her church?
And Aunt Gladys, she always had us up, a little bit before Christmas, and we always enjoyed
One
that.
of the things that was interesting is that we didn't have turkey in those early days. Maybe the boys don't remember that, but it was later before we ever had turkey for family holidays. And usually Grandma had cream chicken, and she had this very special bowl that this cream chicken would be offered in, and they would have plenty of biscuits and this great big bowl of mashed potatoes with butter and salt and pepper all over the top. And a lot of times it was that cream chicken and biscuits and potatoes and gravy we had for the main dish. And then probably pumpkin pie, and Grandma made great pie. I don't know if the boys remember, but she'd spend in the fall and make these great pies. And I remember my mother said, well, that's entirely too much work. But Grandma just thought that we needed a great pie. And then she would have pumpkin pie and so forth. Now, you want to talk about Grandpa.
Yes,
How many people would have been in that house when you celebrated like that?
35.
In that little
I
house?
don't know. And do you know they tried to get
All
everybody
the
sitting
kids,
down
all
at
the
the...
kids.
They tried to seat people at Christmas time.
Oh.
They would try to not have you have to sit off in another room somewhere.
My.
When there were other holiday times, sometimes we'd be out in the bedroom or out on the porch or somewhere.
And I remember we used to have to, Granddad had set up some sawers and
Yeah.
put the table clear out on the porch.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the summertime. But see,
But
at
you couldn't have
Christmas-
gone outside this
No,
time
they
of
tried to
year.
extend it clear in almost to the edge of the bedroom, the table, and we'd try to get everybody around there and eat. And Don was right about that. We'd eat dinner first, and then those gifts and everything were in the afternoon.
Covered about Granddad.
Now, Grandpa, what we said that we wanted to mention about Grandpa is that he had a lot of different kinds of skills and hobbies that didn't show up in his farming practices. And one of the things is he could really work on leather work and so forth. And I really think that it was my dad, where my dad got the idea of working on saddles and leather work was from Grandpa, because Grandpa taught him how to braid. And I don't remember how many strands they could braid.
Right, they used to braid.
They braid in the round. You remember? They'd come up with these.
This
round
is grandfather right here. This is our grandmother. And this is Dad. This is Aunt Gladys. This is Lena. This is Lillis. And this is Uncle Glenn.
About
So-
what time would that have been taken? How old would...
Well, look at the children.
was
You
it
can
on
tell.
the back?
1956.
Okay.
What couldn't have been done.
No, I mean
19
let's see.
No. Oh, that's when he
October.
died. No. Let me look at that picture. Oh,
Let's move along.
Uncle Glenn wasn't very
He
old.
was a teenager,
No.
probably.
It would have been
1920 maybe.
About
or something.
1920.
Okay.
Yeah, I think
not,
so.
that's 65 dates referring to a different date. But
Yeah, that's when
anyway,
his birth and death
uh,
was.
Okay,
this would have been about 1920, in the 20s, early 20s.
okay, thanks.
Yeah. Well, anyway, not only did Grandpa do leather work, and I'm sure that's where my dad found out about how it became interested in working with saddles and braiding, and Grandpa could do all that well. But he was great at repairing shoes, and he even had a repairing kit
Lash.
with the last and all, and he would work on shoes. I remember when we were over there, he would be working on people's shoes. And then the boys have talked about one time the work area he had down in the, what they call that building, wasn't a barn.
Granary and shop.
Yeah, he had a shop down there, and he had actually the whole equipment for blacksmithing. And I can remember when, he actually did shoot horses. I've seen him, them shoeing horses there and melting the babbitt and all this stuff to do other kinds of repair work.
Grandfather could do anything in that type of work. Blacksmithing, anything. He could do it.
They've
Great.
sharpened their plowshares themselves and all those kinds of things. One more thing about Grandpa was that he quit school in 3rd grade because I think we mentioned earlier about how he had to work and help support his mother and father and the family. But he became a great reader. I think in his later days he had read every Zane Grey book that had ever been written.
Yes.
And he also always read Capper's Weekly, read the newspaper. He was not a very fast reader, but he just loved to read. And I can remember seeing him at Aunt Gladys's just sitting and laughing over something he read or something of that
Good.
kind. So in a way you might think, well, we must have more memories of Grandpa than Grandma, but one of the things is that Grandpa lived quite a few years longer.
I was going to ask about her health. When did she...
Well, I think I mentioned that it was back about when I was in first high school, 1932, and she had her first stroke. And see, she died in 43, but her health was poor in all those years
She had some sugar diabetes along with it.
with the strokes, yeah. And so that her foot became very infected and so forth from sugar diabetes. Another thing is Grandpa, very lovingly tried to care for her. Aunt Gladys and the girls would try to come over and do different kinds of things, but
Granddad's death, what they...
it was 56. He died. Donna, maybe I can't keep track of when you were around.
I was a high school senior.
Yeah, because
that
I was
year.
going to say, as the years went on after Grandma died, Grandpa used to come to Colorado
He lived with
and
us,
visit Glenn's, but he also went over to Delta and visited.
I suppose.
But the reason you're saying he lived with you is, that's when he had his final stroke. Was at your house.
Oh,
In
I didn't remember
I
that.
don't know if it was late August. I think it was hot. Wayne and I were already living in Greeley, and we went out to see him. And your dad moved him in his not van. What do you call it? Station wagon. The very next day, I believe it was, to Phillipsburg, and he was put in the hospital there and died. But he had his stroke at your place, and he was upstairs there in the bedroom when Wayne and I went to see him. And afterwards, somebody said, well, Grandpa lost his false teeth in the midst of all that. I said, I know where Grandpa's false teeth are. When I visited that day, they were just thrown on the floor somewhere, and I picked them up and put them under his pillow. And they looked, and they were still under that pillow in your house.
Well, how interesting. I never heard
But
that.
anyway, he did die at Phillipsburg,
At
but your
Phillipsburg.
dad had taken him in that station wagon.
Okay, now we're going to go to church down at Englewood again. We had some really great experiences down there at the church. My folks always went to Sunday morning church services and the Sunday evening, and also the Thursday night prayer meetings. So I remember this one particular night we went down for prayer meeting, and we, Dad always took us boys and sat with us boys, Bill and myself, on the front pew. So Bill and myself were sitting over the right side of Dad, and of course they started off by having testimony service. And we had an old man by the name of Uncle Billy Thompson. And he comes up and going to give his testimony up in front, and he got up to the pulpit and the podium, and he took a hold of that podium part, and he kept shifting it around. And pretty soon he started shifting it over to the side, so I poked old Bill in the side, and I said, wait till that thing falls off. And about that time, it came tumbling down. I jumped out of my seat and clapped my hand and laughed, and boy, Dad grabbed a hold of me, and he said, oh my goodness, Don, "You boys settle down, settle down." So he left Bill over on that side and he put me over on that side. And Dean's going to tell you another story about Englewood.
What I remember about is Mr. Montoni. He'd get up in the mornings on Sunday mornings and sing songs. And he wrote a lot of his own songs. But what he did, he converted a lot of songs over to his own words. Well, one of them I remember was, "Remember the Englewood Valley and the people that love you so true." Yeah, that's what I remember about
And I was telling
Mr.
Dean he
Montoni.
was still singing songs till the day he died up there in the nursing home where Aunt Gladys
Is
was.
that right?
Then another fellow we had in church was Newt Shimmerhorn. Newton Shimmerhorn. We always called him Hoot Shimmerhorn because he had a little pediment in his speech. And it was like young people, we probably weren't too nice to Newt, and he probably would like to have taken us out and strung us up. But anyway, that pretty well brings us up to date, I think, to finish us up on.
Except I wanted to mention something about
Go ahead.
Grandpa Lake.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that we mentioned Grandpa Lake earlier about that he'd lived in Phillips County, but eventually he lived down at Lincoln, Nebraska. And I was just going to mention the reason he lived down there is that Aunt Merle, my mother's sister, or Aunt Merle, lived with him in, later of her years before she was married. And when she was married, she married Fred Kennedy. And Fred Kennedy was a World War I veteran who had veteran benefits, and he wanted to take civil engineering down to the University of Nebraska. So they persuaded Grandpa Lake to move down there with them. And eventually he did get that degree, and he was traveling all over the country. But Grandpa continued to live down there near Lincoln, Nebraska, farming and so forth. And even after Aunt Merle and Uncle Fred went off on their own, Grandpa Lake still lived down there and eventually was in a nursing home, remarried, and died down there in Nebraska and was buried at Plainview, Nebraska.
Okay, so in 1936, in August of 1936, we left Kansas after the Depression, the dust storms, the grasshoppers, and I don't know what all. And Dad was so disgusted, he made a trip ahead of time over there to Delta to Uncle Mutt's and lined up a place for us to move to. And so when we moved to Colorado right at the last part of August in 1936, we had a big semi-truck haul our machinery and this kind of stuff out there to Colorado. And I remember the hay rack. We had to put the hay rack bed clear up on top. And when they got
On
over
the top of what?
the semi-truck,
Oh.
and so when they got over there to go through a tunnel or two, they couldn't get through the tunnel. So they had to take the hay rack and put it over on the right-hand side and tie it along the right-hand side so it'd always be over on the right-hand side of this semi-truck. So they got by that way. And going up Monarch, they had to pull up a ways, and then the driver of the truck would yell at the other old boy, "Block, block." And they'd block that semi-truck going over there.
It must have been really loaded.
It was really loaded.
Yeah, but Don, that's when with Monarch Pass had those one-lane roads.
Right.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
One
still,
lane.
with the
One?
pullouts.
And then you had your pullouts.
Oh, I didn't know
And the
that.
people coming up
Yep.
had the right of way.
Yep.
The ones going down had to pull out the pullouts and let the ones go
Took a
up
long
go by.
time, didn't it?
Yeah.
Oh.
It took 2 days.
The only place I know a road like that's Fall River Road, you know, when you
Yeah,
go.
well, it was a lot like that, and a lot
That's
of it was
the
still
only one I
dirt
know.
roads.
Huh.
It was quite a trip. It took us 2 days, a full 2 days for us to move out when we moved. You know, we had the old 29 Chevy, had the dog in the tub on the side. I don't think you come with us. did
Oh,
you?
no. See, I stayed and went
It
to
was
school
just
at
Mom
Allen.
and Dad and Bill, Don, Daidley, and I, and the dog.
I never
We
ever went
moved
till
out.
the next summer.
Talk about looking like a bunch of Okies. We did.
We had this dog in that boiler sitting right next to
Fido,
the
old Fido.
old Fido, next to the trunk. And we'd always keep looking out the window and looking out the window to see if the old dog was all right. Boy, that old dog was coming right along. He was right along with us. We'd stop and let him out once in a while and go on. Man, he just stayed right in there, just as happy as could be.
Oh, my.
And
Go
so
away.
Dad and Mother, of course, had already been to Delta and had lined up with Uncle Mutt's help a place for us to live just a half a mile north of where Uncle Mutt lived. And we lived right across the corner, the four corners, from the grade school where we went to grade school. So it was real handy for us to go to grade school. Now this was a 80-acre place there that we lived on, and we of course did general farming, and our farming was all done with the horses. And we didn't get our first tractor until about 1938 or 39.
I wondered when that was.
And we had a tremendous neighbor by the name of Ford Sayer. If it hadn't been for Ford Sayer, we probably wouldn't have been able to make it, because I've seen Ford Sayer say, "Hey, Ivan, you need that horse this afternoon, don't you?" And I've seen Ford Sayer pull that horse off from his string of horses and let Dad use old this horse along. We had 3 good horses, but we needed 1 more. And I've seen old Ford Sayer jerk that horse off out of the field day after day and let us use that horse.
Wow.
And we always then worked with Ford Sayer in, he had a grinder, and he had a truck, a nice 34 Chevy truck, and is a real good little truck and so forth. But anyway, Dad worked real close with Ford, and Ford Sayer liked Dad very much, and so it worked out real good. Now, Ford Sayer just lived east of the schoolhouse there, about a quarter of a mile, and so naturally it was right close, so it really worked out good. And I laid out of high school from my in 1937, 1938, that school year there, out of high school, and helped farm on the farm while Bill finished up his schoolwork and was able to play football and athletics.
Well, didn't Bill have a year off when they first moved, though? I don't think he went to high school the first year they moved out there, so they each had a turn at that.
Yeah.
And I didn't move with them, you know. I stayed with Aunt Gladys and had my senior year of high school that year.
In Alma.
In Alma.
Oh, okay.
Right, and we never saw each other all year.
Oh my goodness.
No, not the whole year.
Now, the old 29 Chevy that we're talking about was a tremendous car. It was a super deluxe car, but that sucker, the weak part about it was the axle, rear axle. And we were always breaking off the rear axle.
And it seems like it made a noise even when you didn't.
Doc,
It would grind or something.
Remember when we was moving out and the trunk come open and people come by waving and pointing at that trunk, and we thought, man, they're friendly out here and waving. We finally stopped and looked, the trunk fell open. Dumped some stuff out.
Well, let's see, Dean and the twins were in that grade school.
Yeah, call
Yeah, and you never did lay out a year of high
No,
school.
I
It's
think,
Don and Bill
no,
who did 2 different years.
Did Bill graduate from Columbine?
No, he graduated down at in Kansas before he went. That's what he told
Then
me.
Don and I
And he held out. He didn't go to high school because they didn't move. It was the end of August, wasn't it?
About the end of
And
August.
he didn't go to high school that year. Then see what Don's talking about, because you graduated from 8th grade.
I went to school the end of my 7th grade and 8th grade.
Yeah.
And the thing I remembered about that Columbine school, there were 3 teachers. And we probably had the best teachers that I've ever seen any place, any time. I would put them up against any of them. And the ones that I particularly remember were Mr. Hanson, who taught the 7th and 8th grade, and he was also the principal and the general superintendent and so forth for the school. There were 2 ladies that taught. Dean had a lady by the name of Mrs. Petrofesso, who was an Italian gal and beautiful gal. I remember her.
Yeah, I kind of remember.
And then there was another lady that had the 1st and 2nd grades, and Mrs. Petrofesso, I guess she had the what? 3rd, 4th, and 5th?
Yeah, 3rd, 4th, and 5th.
And 6th, I guess it was. 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th. And so we did. I really felt like that we really got a good education in that Columbine school.
Did that probably affected some of your choice of vocation?
Well, the thing that affected my choice of going into as a teacher of vocational agriculture was in World War II, when I went into the service. I had already been through high school, and I took vocational agriculture in high school. And I liked it very much, but I hadn't made up my mind to be a vocational ag teacher at that time. But as it went into the service, and they said just at the time we were going to go overseas, they said, well, we expect the war to be over before too long, going overseas. So over at Camp Ord, California, why, I was kind of walking across the field there, and I got to thinking, well, they said, get some books lined up so you'll have some books to occupy your time overseas, because we're going to try to get this war to an end. And so, and it was just right after that.
You mean that was about 1945 or something?
And so I went overseas, and when I was out on the ship troop transport going overseas, I had my basic training in the infantry, and I was scheduled to be gun fodder. In other words, replacement. And if we'd had to go into Yokohama after I arrived my first place in Yokohama, I was scheduled to go into the Philippines, Luzon, the Philippines, and then it worked out that the war then came to an end right then when we were out, and we were the first troop ship to go directly into Yokohama. So I missed that part of having to be gun fodder. But I'll tell you one thing: people might talk about that atomic bomb being inhumane, but this guy wouldn't be here today if it hadn't been for that. I'll tell you that.
What branch of the service were you in?
I was in the infantry,
Okay.
the Army infantry.
Well,
I
maybe
see.
Dee needs to
And
tell about when he went
I
to
jumped
service.
the gun
I was
on the
too.
time, but
But I think we ought to mention the fact that Bill was in the Navy during this
Yeah.
time during World War
Okay,
II,
so-
and he
And
served
he went
on the
earlier
aircraft carrier USS Saratoga, and they was in several battles.
in the South Pacific.
He served all the way up through the South Pacific.
Of course, then Don was in the Army, I was in the Navy, Lee was in the Army, and Dee was in the Navy.
oh, so you all served?
Yeah,
Wow.
all of us.
So then, during that time, of course, when Bill and Don were over, were service, why, I and Lee and Dee and Dad did most of the farming, and we farmed the French place. Then we rented another 60 acres, I guess it was, the Nordine place, and we farmed all that time with 2 head of horses and the big John Deere. That's when Bill and Don were gone. Then, of course, Uncle Mutt, when I say Uncle Mutt, that's Uncle Mutt Patnode, which was Grandma's brother. And like Don had said, he lived just a little ways from us, and he was always coming down, especially when we were kids, and wanting somebody to come up and help him. I know that eventually us boys was always making up excuses so we wouldn't have to go down and help him.
He made you work.
He
huh?
was he was a pretty decent uncle, yes, but in other ways he was very unappreciative. He kind of.
Well, I think he had always, through his life, thought of ways to get ahead, and that
I
was
would
one
like to
way.
ask you one thing, Evelyn.
He was looking for something for nothing. That's what he was looking
he's
for.
trying to.
Now, Grandpa's nephews, Uncle Fred's boys, moved to Colorado. What, a year after we did?
Well, I thought it was the same year.
Was it?
Oh,
Yeah,
yes,
well,
the
anyway,
same year.
what I-
Albert's and
Albert,
Bob's.
Albert's
Okay.
and Bob's. Well, what I'd like to mention, we were talking about family gatherings. Why, I remember Albert and Martha had Thanksgiving dinner. Bob and Myrtle had Easter dinner. Uncle Mutt and Aunt Lena had New Year's dinner. And then we always had Christmas dinner at our house.
Great.
And we
Yeah.
did this for years.
And they became your family because
Yeah.
they were around there.
Of course, we lived close.
Of course, Bob and Myrtle are gone,
And then,
and so's Martha, but you know, Albert's still alive at 93.
Bob
He made
Jr.,
Aunt Lena.
you know, Bob's son and I and Lee and stuff a lot. We run around a lot together and did quite a few things. And then Warren a lot. Maxine lived there with her folks. of
Bill
course,
says
but-
Maxine's been down in Arizona just now, and he's seen
And
her.
then, of course, Warren and Don run around a lot together.
Yeah, they did. You just
Well,
said
we were
that's
pretty
your
close family. We kept the family traditions going
Good.
because we
Good.
were always close.
I don't think we've seen the picture of your parents' wedding, and then maybe the your family picture of Colorado. Yeah, just hold that.
Yeah. Now remember, they were married
All right, you tell.
September 3rd, 1919, at Uncle Frank Lake's,
Okay.
after Dad had come home from the service.
I'm just particularly proud of this picture because looky how superior looks you have right there in Dad and my mother. Just beautiful people.
I think it's a lovely wedding picture.
It is a beautiful
Mother
picture.
always said it wasn't taken, I think, until a few weeks after the wedding, and she had been a little disappointed about that and thinks her dress looks wrinkled or something, but I didn't think it looked
No.
too bad.
While you're speaking about that, I'd like to
Yeah,
say
you
something
want
about
that
that.
one? Okay. Go ahead.
This was when we were all a lot younger. And that, I think about the time, I don't remember where Bill was at. I think that was maybe even before he went into the Navy. But I had mentioned before, and everybody had how religious, and when it comes Sunday, how Dad thought about Sunday and going to church and everything. And I don't remember ever being late to Sunday school, ever. And we were always told to get ourselves ready and go to church. But anyway, this one Sunday morning, Don and I and Dean Lee were down behind the barn playing softball. We'd gotten the chores done. We went down and thought we'd have a softball game, so we were down there playing softball. And Dad hollered at us once and told us to come and get ready, and of course we didn't pay that much attention. And so he hollered again and told us, come and get ready for church. So we kind of looked up, of course, but we didn't really make a move towards the house. But about that time, we looked up, and here come Dad around the corner of the barn with a big stick in his hand. So we took off on the dead run. Before we got to the house, he spanked every one of us.
Oh, my.
He caught D's, he went through the door.
You got the message there.
You know,
But you're
always on
supposed to get
Sunday,
the
you better
church.
start stepping, because if you didn't, she was going to get it.
Well, I remember, we went to that church. I wasn't thinking the kids were always so real pleased to go to church. They used to say, this is the church of the halt and the maimed and the blind. You remember that?
But that was the Nazarene church.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, we
but
didn't
where
go
you-
to Wesleyan Church.
No, but that's where Dad was getting you ready to go
Yeah,
when he was
we
giving you the
were
spanking.
always, I don't ever remember being late to church.
No.
Sunday school.
Mm-hmm.
And of
Dad,
course,
go ahead.
then I had mentioned Uncle Mutt and his wife Aunt Lena. Well, Aunt Lena was my Sunday school teacher for years. You know, and in fact, I have the Bible she gave me when I was in Sunday school still at home, and she wrote my name in it. Of course, I still got it.
Yeah, she was, Uncle Mud went to church there too,
Yeah.
but not as faithful as Aunt Lena.
Aunt Lena was my Sunday school
Yeah,
teacher.
she was
you know,
very
for
faithful
several years.
going there to Sunday school. And of course, Albert and Martha went there
Yeah,
then too.
Albert Martha,
Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
Now, Bob didn't. I think Bob and Myrna went somewhere else.
Methodist. I
Yeah.
think they went to Methodist
But
church.
anyway, they did. Well, now, you know, in all that time, I wasn't even around. You realize that, don't you?
Well, Evelyn,
Okay,
when you
now
come back,
We'll come back to Evelyn
Yeah.
here because I want her to explain, you know, how she, when she did come to Colorado and about going up to Gunnison to school at Western State and this type of thing. But anyway, I'd like to pick up there where I was in reason that I didn't, or that I selected vocational agriculture. As I pointed out, going across this one parade ground and over to a bookstore, actually, why I had made the decision to be a vocational ag teacher at that time. But I could have been swayed pretty easy not to be. But anyway, I did get some books and so forth, and I did shove a couple books into my duffel bag, took it overseas with me and went overseas. But when I came back, then in 46, I guess it was, when I came back from overseas in 46, why, Bill had already been home, of course, and they were trying to get going a little bit, but he was at that time in California. Bill was working in California, and he met this lady in California with 3 boys, and then they were married. But Bill hadn't come to Colorado yet.
What kind of work was that? He was doing something about,
he was,
he
going
was
to
an
school in
airplane
California.
mechanic.
He
I
was
thought.
an airplane mechanic on that ship.
And I thought he was in California
It's
too.
called a machinist mate. And he worked clear at the top as far as being a machinist mate on that Saratoga. And he came in 3 different times after being out, they'd be out for, several months, and then they came in to the West Coast and restock up again and then go back out. So Bill started with the Saratoga way at the south end of the chain of islands called the New Hebrides Islands, way down there, just off from the Australian, just northeast of Australia. And then they served all the way up through. But anyway, there then is when I came back from overseas, my dad picked me up in Grand Junction, and we came on home, and I had a little 38 Ford that I had before I left, and I told the folks when I'd buy me a new one when I got home. So I let them take over that little Ford, and I didn't know what a mistake I'd made. I should have jacked it up and had it so when I got home. But anyway, one thing I didn't like about it, it had mechanical brakes, and you better start stopping 100 yards from where you wanted to stop, or you wouldn't get stopped. But anyway, Dad said to me, he said, I stayed that first year there with him in 47 to help him harvest the crop. Let's see, that'd been the last of 46 and into 47. I helped him get that crop planted in 47, and then I had made the decision that I would go over to Colorado State University and use the GI Bill and take vocational ag teachers training. So that's actually what I did. But to mention also, Dad asked me there, he said, Don, he said, would you want to go into this farming program with me? He said, we've got this farm down here next to us. Dad had 120 acres there on that place he was on. And he said, we can get this other 80 down here, and then we can get that other 40 over there, and then we'll pick up this other 80 on up here to the north. And he said, that'll give us all this right here together. And so he said, you think about it, he said, because he said, we need to move on it now if we're going to. So I'd just gotten married. And so I said, well, I better talk to my wife tonight, and we'll try to make a decision. So I went home, we talked it over with Nancy, and Nancy says, Don, you want to remember, there's 4 other boys, and they have just as much right going into farming with your dad as you do. And she says, I don't know how it'd work. She says, I think if it's just the boys, it'd be all right. But she said, you get 4 of those wives involved, or 5 wives involved too, and you've got some problems. And so I could see right there and then that probably the best thing to do was to not go into farming. But I'll tell you one thing. If I had gone in with Dad, we'd have made her. And I'll tell you what, he had some good plans planned ahead, because he was ready to go on it. And I turned it down. I'd probably been further ahead today financially if I had it. But I don't think the family. See, been a bunch of family problems. So I think as I look back on it, that was probably the best. And so that was the reason. Now,
Did any of the boys take him up on that offer?
well, Bill tried to go, but
Okay.
Bill was no farmer. He
Okay.
just couldn't. He
You
married,
worked that several years, I think.
and Dad tried to help him, but he wouldn't take Dad's advice. And I shouldn't say that in here in this picture, should I? Well,
Say
anyway,
that poor thing be safe.
it was tough, and it didn't work out. And so Bill then came over to, he finally tried farming for a while, and it didn't work, so he came over to Fountain and lived at Fountain, and he worked in construction. And he
Yeah,
worked
for
on the
number of
Eisenhower
years.
Tunnel, in
Now
fact.
you ought to just name off Bill's family.
And Bill married this lady, Eileen,
Perriott.
Who?
Perriott was her name.
Perriott.
The boy's name.
from Nebraska. They were originally from Nebraska, and they had moved to California, and she'd married this man. They moved to California, and they had 3 boys. The oldest boy was Bob, and the second boy was Dennis, and the third boy was Donnie. And Donnie's the one that played and kicked for the Cleveland Browns for 14 years. And Donnie then, Bill adopted those 3 boys, and then they had twin boys themselves. And so Bill worked all the time in construction out of in general, Colorado Springs and Fountain, which is real close. and he worked all the way from Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and a little bit of northern New Mexico in construction work. A lot of work with tunnels and roads and all that kind of work.
What were the twins' names?
Jerry and Gary. Jerry and Gary were the twins. And
They finally moved over to Alamosa when the boys were going to college.
then Bill and Eileen split up. And at that time that they were over there at Alamosa, and they were split up for 3 or 4 years, and then they went back together and moved over to Cedar Ridge. And let's see, what Bill did at Cedar Ridge?
Well, he worked for the state.
Yeah.
He worked in, worked with honor camps and all
Okay.
kinds of things for the state. Yeah, that's what he did over there.
All right, let's go on. Now, I'd like for Evelyn to cover the part when she came to Colorado.
Well, you see, I told you a while ago that I finished my high school the year they moved to Colorado. I stayed with Aunt Gladys and Uncle Charles and graduated from high school. Well, those were in the Depression years. I graduated from high school in the spring of '37, and I got a chance to teach out of high school there in Nebraska. So that's what I did one year. But I came home for the summer and was with them during the summer, and they were proud to show me the farm, all the things that were going on. And we had a trip to Ouray, and we tried to do some things, but that's all I was home. And then I went back to Nebraska and taught school that year. Well, I got $40 a month, and I remember my mother said if that's the only way it was going to be, that I better go to college and do better, because in Colorado you could do better. So then I went home after that year, again, just taught 1 year in Nebraska, and it was at a school where it's under the Harlan County Dam area now. It's in that very same area. Anyway, like Don said, I went to Gunnison School, and I went 2 years to Gunnison to school, and we had a really hard time because my folks were trying to help me. I worked for my board. We borrowed money for my books. I found a way to borrow some money. And we also borrowed some money. We started out borrowing $100 from Uncle Mutt for the tuition. But finally, I got through enough so that I could teach. I got 2 years done and almost a third year done, and I taught school. And I taught school 2 years up at Paonia. And that's when that picture was taken, was when I was teaching school up at
Let's see it.
Paonia.
Lambert.
That's when it was.
Evelyn
All right.
Lambert Mesa.
All right, now we've moved to Colorado, and this would be, I suppose, here the twins would be about how old? They would be Lee and Dee.
Let's see if I can figure it.
Lee and Dee are the
It was like
twins.
40 or 41 or
Okay.
something like that's when it was.
This would be about 1940 or 41, because you'll notice Bill right here has this suit on. And then you notice I have a suit on too. Well, Bill worked at J.C. Penney's
I forgot he worked at J.C. Penney.
right out of school. He worked at J.C. Penney's for about
2 or 3 years.
2 or 3
Before he
years,
went to service.
and he was able to buy these suits and good clothes and shoes and so forth at his cost. So that worked out real good. But anyway, this is Dad, this is Mother, this is Dean, and this is Evelyn, all dressed up.
Yeah, I had the big hats in those
There's
days.
there's Bill, and
That
there's
I must have been
myself.
related to you as my big hats.
Absolutely.
And of course, then there's Dee and Lee. So this would have been about in 1940.
Well, I know
We,
that's when I was teaching.
We
I
had
was
this
41.
a 35 Chevrolet car right here. We traded off the old 29 Chevy and bought this 35 Chevrolet, and the house, and we always called it the French place. This is part of the house you can see here in the background. It was a nice home. It was a very nice home, and it had, well, let's see, it had a large porch on the west side all the way across, and then we had a kitchen and a dining room, and then we had the living room and parlor, and we had 2 bedrooms on the north from those rooms, and then we had an enclosed-in porch on the east, and Dad had enclosed that porch on the east, and when we moved there, all that was there was just the house. Man, that was just bare ground. And Dad right away put in a yard fence, about 5 feet tall, all the way around, and we planted grass. planted grass immediately and got a yard going. It never was the best yard in the world, but at least it was closed in, and we tried to have a pretty good yard. But at that time, no indoor plumbing, and I can remember.
We had electricity though, Don. Wasn't
Yeah,
that special?
we had electricity. We did have
Bulbs hung
electricity.
down from the
Yeah,
ceiling.
from the ceiling. And do you remember, he mentioned Ford Sears earlier. Anyway, they got a new refrigerator, and they were selling their old one of those that had those big
Yeah.
things on the top. And I remember our begging Dad to buy that refrigerator, and so we did get a refrigerator. How much was it we paid for that? $25 or
Probably
something?
so.
What a
And,
luxury.
oh, we were
I
so
think it's $15. $15.
So pleased to have Ford Sears cast off refrigerator. That was really great. Well, anyway, then you see, I taught 2 years up there, and then when Bill was thinking he's going to have to go into the service, so he wanted to go back to Kansas for the summer, and he did do that, and he persuaded me I could go too. So we went to Phelps County for the summer, and he worked in wheat harvest and visited around, and I visited around too, and that's when I met Wayne again, and when we became engaged. So that must have been 42 that summer.
Okay, you've got her in there now. Why don't you explain
Yeah.
all that?
Well, anyway, we were back there, and Bill stayed a good many weeks. I don't know all the people he helped, but he worked, and he thought that was great to be able to do that before he'd have to do anything else. Then I came back home again, and Bill came before me even. I don't know what he was doing. He wasn't still working at Penny's, was he?
No.
He must not have been then.
He's just getting ready to go in the service.
Yeah, he was, and he also, I think, was even thinking that he might be able to go down to Grand Junction and go to college a little bit while he
He
was
did.
waiting.
He did.
Now, that's what
A
he
couple
did
of
that
years at
fall.
Basic.
That's
That
what he
fall,
did. He
that
went to
fall,
college that fall.
And he and 2 other of his close buddies.
Yeah, that's what they did. And I taught school again at another school, and oh, what an increase in salary I got. I'd been getting $80 and $85 and $90 a month up there at Lambert Mesa. But I got $135 a month that year because the war was coming on, you see. And there were fewer teachers and so forth. But anyway, that year I got ready to get married. And then I was married in June of 43.
Where were you married?
We were married in the Nazarene Church down there in Delta.
In Delta.
And we thought about the flowers even. We didn't buy any flowers except my wedding bouquet. But Mom and I and some of them went around and we collected, in June there were fresh flowers. We got all kinds of fresh flowers at people's houses and put those all around, and it was very nice. It was a small wedding, a Thursday afternoon wedding, and then we had a little reception out at the house. And I never will forget, after that reception was over, how you have cake. What we had was cake and ice cream and punch. Well, Don said he's hungry, so he cooks himself some steaks for supper. And he was wondering if some more people didn't want some steaks too. But I remember he was in there cooking, fixing himself steak for supper.
Sure.
Well, along with that, of course, Wayne then came to Colorado.
That was the summer before, yeah, when we were engaged. Is that what you mean?
In his 41 Ford. 41 Ford. Great car. Beautiful
Yeah, we
car.
had that
I'll
same
never
year.
forget. And didn't he bring Aunt Lila?
Yes, and
Aunt Lena and
Kenneth.
Aunt Gladys.
No, not Aunt Gladys then. You see, after we were engaged, this was 42, and that summer, he came out to see me just before I started teaching school that fall. And that's when he brought Aunt Lena and Kenneth. And he was trying to teach me to drive the car. And Kenneth would go along. Now, why, I don't know, but he did. And he would get so upset with me trying to learn to drive the car that he'd lay down in the back seat and just peek up every now and then to see how I was getting along. Now, wouldn't it have been better if he stayed at home?
I would have thought so.
He was along with us for some peculiar reason.
Well, I was too. That
Oh, you were too?
Sure.
Oh, my.
You probably needed chaperoning.
I
Do you
guess it
suppose?
sure helped, don't you?
Yes.
Wait, don't you remember when we went down through National Monument?
Oh, yeah, when we took
Well,
trips.
that's when Kenneth
But-
was there.
Yes, but I'm talking about just sometimes when we went out to learn to drive the car.
Or we had to go along and supervise.
I'm
sure
they were a
Pick
big
up
help.
you, you know.
Yeah, they were a big help. Well, I never did learn to drive the car very well that summer. Anyway, I
Was
love
that
that deal.
was that right at the next day after you were married?
No.
You went up on Grand Mesa and
No, that was
coming
the-
down over Land's End?
No, that was still the summer before when Wayne came out there with that car when we were still engaged.
Oh,
After we were married, we didn't go with them anywhere. You know, Don, what we did do? We went down past Uray to Telluride, or not Telluride, but down that direction, and you did go as far as Montrose, and you, Ray, you and Grandma, not Grandma, you and Grandpa, and Wayne's mother and Aunt Gladys, and you drove a car too, and then after we ate together down at your Ray, I think.
Then you went on.
And then we went on, and they came back.
Where did you go on the rest of your trip?
We went on down to Durango and to Mesa Verde. And the only reason, that was war. And we had gas rationing and so forth. Well, Uncle Mutt gave us some extra gas, and somehow Wayne had saved some. That's the only way we even got to do that much. And then we went back to Phillips County, and Wayne finished up farming there at the Bakers that summer, and then we moved to Mountainville.
Now, that was the war. Bill went into the war, I believe it was in 42, right after, let's see, they went down to Mesa College and started Mesa College, and he and Tommy Bowl and Carl Dorsey were the three guys that went down to Mesa College and played football.
And how long did they go down there?
And so they went down to Mesa College and were in Mesa College that fall, and then come that spring, they went into the service. And so in the later spring, Tom Bowl, a good friend, went into the service. And he went into the Army, and he lost his life over in Europe, and in the invasion, going into on what was that called?
VJ
Day
Day.
or something?
VJ Day.
VJ Day
Yeah,
or whatever it was. He lost his life over there.
VE Day, baby.
And VE.
Europe.
VE.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
VE. And so Bill and Tom and Carl Dorsey were three guys that got right in on all of the war. See?
Well, you see what they must have. The war started in the. You're right. They did get in earlier.
December the 11th, was it, or 7th
7th.
of 1941.
41,
When the Japs
yeah.
attacked Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
So see, it was going on even when he went back to Kansas. I was telling you about the harvest and so forth, and so he knew he was going to be
He
called
must
up.
have been 43 when he went in. 42 or 43, I can't
Yeah.
remember. But anyway, I graduated from high school in 43. And Bill was already in the service and had been in there, for about a year. So Dad told me, he said, I need you to help on the farm, so if it's all right with you, Don, I'm going to get you an agriculture deferment. So he got me an agriculture deferment for 1 year. And that's the reason that I didn't get into service right away. I didn't go in until a year later. And so, and of course, I went over to the Pacific. And so Bill, like we said, was in the Navy. And then after World War II, or start toward the end of World War II, Dean was in the service, and then Dean Lee. Now, Dean Lee would have served during the time of the Korean, I believe, encounter, or right at the end of the Korean. I'm not right sure. Right in there about that time. But
I don't know either, but Dean knows about. Dean, when was that you went in the Navy?
That was in 1946.
46.
okay, so where did you?
When I went in, I went to the service in 1946, and then Bill was in Van Nuys, California at that time, going to school.
He'd gotten out.
Schooling.
He'd gotten out of.
And then we went up and seen Aunt Ellen while we was out there, a couple, 3 times. And then who was the relation that lived over there on the other side? And it was
Other side of what?
the ones that come back to Colorado that year, and Bill, and then went up on Soap Creek fishing. Don, remember that? What was
You
their
mean
names?
that wasn't any of Aunt Ellen?
Alexander's?
Wasn't
No.
that Aunt Ellen's relatives?
Yeah.
See,
Well,
she
it
had
was
relatives.
I wouldn't know, Dean. I wasn't there.
Aunt Ellen used to come back to visit various people, and that Doyle, the Jordans, Aunt Ellen's last name was Jordan. And some of her relatives, her children, would come sometimes. I wondered if it was one of them.
Where did you serve, Dean, in the service?
Just around local, mostly.
Okay. Okay.
But in which ocean or whatever?
Well, it was on the West Coast.
West Coast. But then the twins were in the Korean.
No. Neither one of them were, I don't think. Lee was in the Army then, soon after I was in the Navy.
But he
But I
got
don't think
some
he went
kind.
overseas, but then he was in the Navy, he was in Japan for 7 months,
Oh.
for quite a while before he.
Well, the reason Lee wasn't is because Donna Lee's father died and he got an agricultural
That was after.
Yeah.
deferment and came home. And I think he was only in the Army about 9 months, wasn't
Well,
he,
that was
Lee?
afterwards. But Lee's service in the Army was on the East Coast.
Yeah.
He was in the Army, and he was the head one in a group
What are you
that
doing, drinking my water?
would receive these bodies that were coming back, and then take them to the family and have the military funeral there. Lee was the I don't know, the head one, so to speak. He was one that
I'd
that
forgotten
called
about
for him to present arms, you know, and then fire and all this kind of stuff. And then he's the one that was to go to that family, the very first one with the American flag, and say, "Here's your son."
Yeah. Wow. What
And
a ministry.
that was tough.
Yeah.
That was tough.
So that wasn't the Korean War. That was after
No, that was right after
II.
World War II,
Yeah,
when
I
they were
was
bringing
thinking
the
it
bodies
was-
of those fellas home. Why Lee and all that, I've forgotten what unit that was, but he was in that unit that worked that part. And he said, "I'm glad it was for only about 9 months," because he said that was really a tough deal.
Yes.
And
Definitely.
so then, well, that was over with. And Ivan himself served in World War I, and then all of his sons served in World War II, and going on
Or
at
soon
the end
after.
of World War II. We're in the military
That's amazing.
up through there. So you see, age made quite a bit of difference.
That's right. That's right.
Age made quite a bit of difference. And so let's move into the part of the actual farming and so forth in Colorado. I remember the years that I was out of school. We plowed with a one moldboard plow, and it all through the soil one way. And we used five head of horses on the plow. We had 3 on the lead and 2 on the tongue. And I did probably 90% of the plowing. And so on 80 acres, why, there'd be about half of that to plow, because half part of it being to alfalfa. And well, I guess there'd be a little more than that to plow. But anyway, we grew sugar beets and potatoes and some grain and alfalfa and some corn.
Onions.
And Bill would always have a few onions. Bill had to have 2 or 3 acres of onions no matter what. So we had 2 or 3 acres of onions, I remember. And I'm speaking now of the first place we lived on, which we called was a French place. And this was a rented place. And Bill, when he went in the service, had these onions. And so some people by the name of Pope, Bob Pope, June Pope, and another lady, a sister-in-law of, Jack Sayer's wife. What was her name?
I know.
Louise.
Yeah, Louise.
Louise
right.
Pope, the sister of Bob Pope. They always topped onions and did a lot of topping. So to help Bill out, what they did is they came over there and they topped all of those onions for nothing, and sent Bill a note and said, "That's to show our appreciation."
Oh my goodness.
And
They were just fine people.
So they did all that just for appreciation to Bill going into military service. And these are the kind of people that we had really for neighbors. And they were very helpful people. And of course, one other thing I'd have to mention would be that if my mother hadn't have been such a good manager, with family manager, and she always had the chickens, the cream, and of course then Dad raised beef, cattle, and sheep and hogs, so we had
And
our
they had a
meat.
garden too.
And Mother would always have a big garden, and so if it hadn't been that she was really a good manager, why, we probably wouldn't have made it. I remember the drought and depression and dust storms in Kansas. I remember them now and look back on it. And I don't know how in the world we did make it, because I'll tell you what, times were really tough.
Mother especially enjoyed the fruit on the western slope.
yeah,
She
tell about
really
that.
did. She loved to get fruit and can it. I think she's the proudest of her jars of canned fruit of anything she ever had or did. She would have jars and jars of peaches. I don't know how many she canned. How many was it?
Oh, you could imagine how much you
Peaches.
can with 5 boys.
Yeah, lots and lots of peaches, some
Probably
plums,
200.
some pears, tomatoes, just
Everything.
canned everything. Made pickles.
Did the boys help her with that garden stuff and
Oh,
canning?
yeah, some.
I
They
thought-
didn't help the canning though,
No,
and I
not
wasn't
canning.
around.
You weren't there.
No,
Dad
she
used to
did
help
that
her some.
canning.
It'll amaze you the amount of work my mother could do. I'll
Yeah,
tell you
that it would because
Plus
you know.
cooking for all the boys
Oh, for that big a
and
family.
for help too.
Yeah.
Martha would generally come over and help her a little bit when we were thrashing or something like that.
Yes, she was very close to
And
Martha.
Martha's Albert's wife would be a cousin. And Martha would come over and help Mother some. But Mother was always one that she just kind of felt like she wanted the people to get away from her. Just let me get in there and do it. And she could do it too, boy.
Yeah, if you gave her time.
And
She
then
probably
she-
learned that without having a mother at home.
Yes, I think.
And then when it came time to get it put on the table, that's when these other ladies came in pretty handy on that and got the food on that table because we had some pretty good sized crews, thrashing crews and that type of that type
And
of
Mother,
thing.
another thing, she loved to have company.
And the
And
other
we had company, you know, quite a little bit.
another thing there in Colorado was that, as I said, I guess we got that B John Deere tractor in about 19. It was a 41, I believe. Is that right, Dean?
You said we got it 39. Well, if it was a 41, we got
Okay,
it
I made a
43,
mistake on that. We got that tractor
about 1943.
I didn't realize it was
42
that late.
or 43 because when we got that tractor, Dad also bought the cultivator and a plow,
Corn planter.
a corn planter, and I don't know
Disc.
several items of equipment that went with it, and he bought all that for. I'm afraid to even mention how much he paid for all that equipment, just as compared to what it would be nowadays. But anyway, for probably less than $3,000, Dad had bought all that equipment, the tractor and everything. So
God, we farmed so fast with that beat John Deere, we had to go out and rent some more ground. We had too much spare time.
oh, I'll never forget, boy, graduating over to plowing the ground with that John Deere with that mounted plow.
Did you get to do some of that?
Oh, I did a lot of it. And I'll tell you, Dad, well, you see, that John Deere was noted for its good brakes. And what you could do, you come right up to the end, and step on that trip, on that plow, just with your foot. At the same time, you just throttle her down a little, and you swing that baby around, and boy, you'd be back in the ground
your
and going
way.
right down through the field. Well, Dad got on there. He says, I'll take it over the noon hour, and you go in and get something to eat. So I said, I'll stay here then till you make that first round. So I got on there, and I said, he got on her, and I had it turned around. So he went down through the field, and boy, he got at that other end, and he didn't throttle her down, you know, and he tripped right, he was going to bring her right around in there. And man, those old brakes on that tractor just slid that front end right around. And Dad was trying to turn it. So when he got up there to the other end where I was, I said, hey, wait a minute, Dad, stop. I said, throttle that thing down. Throttle her down so you can handle it at the end. So he throttled her way down, and then he could handle it. So I went on in and got something to eat. But boy, we had a good time, though.
Oh, yeah. But you know, Dad always loved his horses. He always did. So I guess it was not easy for him maybe to change over.
We had, in general, we always had 4 pretty darn good horses. And then we had one riding horse along with him. And in Kansas, my dad had his favorite horse, old Cupid, in Kansas. And we in the drought years, Dad sent old Cupid up to the sand hills of Nebraska for pasture over the winter, and old Cupid didn't come back. So he said, boy, you'll never do anything like that again. So when we got to Colorado, in a few years after we'd been in Colorado, I had a little mare, name I called her Babe, and we had this little mare, very similar to one that I had in Kansas, And but anyway, we didn't really have. I didn't after going to Colorado. I really didn't have too much riding horse there, but in Kansas, we
have pictures.
we
of
had
people on
two good
Cupid.
riding horses.
Well, didn't your dad continue riding even up in later years?
Oh,
Oh
yeah.
yeah, we have pictures after he
I
married.
thought.
You know.
Yes,
Yeah.
Edna.
We used to go with Bobby up there on the Bob's Ranch and ride that horse.
Oh
All
yeah.
Yeah,
time
right. Dad
stars,
liked
he
to
was-
ride.
He was along and he was probably in his 70s at that time, probably still
Well, might have
riding.
been still riding a
Yeah.
horse.
To occupy his time even
Yeah.
in his later years, he'd buy these old saddles and he'd fix them all over.
That,
made
that
bridles,
kept
he
up
made
your dad,
shafts.
your
Right.
grandfather's
Yeah.
activities.
I don't
Yeah.
know what happened to that last saddle. Bill had it, and then I don't know what did happen.
Well,
Bill had it.
lately, or he probably.
One of them still has it, I think.
But
Yeah.
he made shafts along with it.
Yeah,
Shafts
he
and
worked a
bridles,
lot of time on
halters.
that saddle.
He repaired saddles.
Yeah,
Neighbors
he
would
did.
bring in saddles and he'd work them over.
When I was with my family and living over at Fort Morgan, I went over to Fort Morgan in '65 teaching vocational agriculture over there. And I'd say about 1970, why I bought a riding horse for my children, and particularly Sally, our daughter, liked to ride that horse, and his name was Rebel. He's a bay horse with a white spot in his head, but for some reason everything Sally'd tell him to do, he'd do. And Sally just rode that horse, and my father made a bridle and a saddle, repaired a saddle, and gave it to Sally for that horse, and a blanket too, a saddle blanket. And Dad was real good with those kind of things, so we had that horse over there for a long time, and so Sally would ride him real often. Now my other two boys didn't particularly like to ride him, but Sally did.
Well, are we going to take a break and think if we're done with this,
Now,
or how
let's
much
take
more
a
we're
break.
going to say here
Then I'll pick up there
with the families?
when we still lived on Ash Mesa.
Right.
Yeah, that's where
Sounds
you're
good.
going to start.
Some of the things I remember there on Ash Mesa, of course, was more or less maybe after Don had went into service. Or maybe I should fill in a little bit first about he mentioned onions and how we used to grow onions and used to hate to top onions and there's another thing, Don, we always thinned our own beets on Ash Mesa.
Yeah.
Oh, what
we
a
didn't hire
job.
it done. Then a little later, that's when Don had left. Bill and Don were both gone, and I and Dean Lee were still at home. We still grew beets and everything, but the topping and the thinning was all done by prisoner of war. They had a prisoner of war camp in Delta, and we went down and got the prisoner of war.
Is that
They
right?
were German prisoners is who they were, and they come out and did all of our
Well, see, they used those
thinning
around
and
here.
topping, and
Ah.
it was fun to sit out there and listen to them sing, that.
Tell about D, saying he's ready to go. He just.
Yeah, that was me talking.
Oh,
That was
was it?
me. That was
Hey, I better tell that story.
Yeah,
He's talking,
don't tell that
he's
story.
talking about topping beets and
Thinning,
thinning beets and everything, and we used to go out there with those little short-handled hoes
I did that
and
too.
block them,
Yeah, you've
block
done
'em-
it too. Huh?
block them and thin them out. And so that one day, I'll never forget, old Dean was tired, and we were all tired. Old Dean looks up and he said, he said, I wish I could just die right now. He said, I'd go to heaven because I'm ready to go. And he says, we get out of all this work and all these kneeling on our knees and our legs getting cramped and our back aching and oh man. So he was ready to go. So he was sure like for God to take him right at that time.
We were getting onto the onions, buddy. I used to cultivate onions with a burro, cultivated 2 rows at a time. I remember when I was out in Lawrence last summer, I was telling Lawrence boys about that and mentioned to them that's the way they ought to do is grow some onions and cultivate that way. I don't think they believe me. Tell them
Probably
some
not.
of the old stories. But anyway, then getting on, then after that, we moved over then on the river there out west of Delta. We didn't own the French place. We rented the French place. We rented the Nordine place, but then Dad bought the place over northwest of Delta, where we lived for several years. And then that's when I left and went to service. Then I was gone for a while. That's when you come back down for a while. Then, of course, after I got out of the Navy, that's when I first got married. And I had a son, Douglas, and two twin daughters, Amy and Kathy. Then, after I moved to the Eastern Slope, I got divorced. Then the woman I married had two sons. So we have between us we had 5 children and 8 grandchildren, 2 great grandchildren. Then getting back to Dee and Lee, Lee married a local girl by the name of Donna Gore, and they had 2 sons, Gordy and Larry, and a daughter, Janelle. And I guess, what do they have now? 2 grandchildren? 3 grandchildren? 4 grandchildren.
They have 6
Oh
grandchildren.
yeah, 6 grandchildren.
Because each of those have 2 children.
Mm-hmm.
Then Dee, of course, married over there. He had a son, Rick, and he has, what, 3 or 4 grandchildren?
3 children.
3 grandchildren. But I don't know, I guess maybe that's about there's one other thing I'd like to mention too, was about the Evelyn said something about Don going out and cooking his own steak.
Yeah, he did it.
Well, when we lived on Ash Mesa, we had a big back porch, and we had a table on the back porch. And I remember when we butchered, we did all of our own butchering. And Dad would just take the meat and lay it on the back porch in the wintertime, kept frozen. When Mom wanted meat or something like that, they'd just go out and cut it off and we'd cook it that way.
Pretty
Especially
handy.
big.
And of course, with as many boys as there was in our family, it didn't last very long.
That's
it went
right.
pretty fast.
When you got out of the service, did you consider helping Dad on the farm?
Well, not really. I didn't want that much to do with it, really, I guess. But then, after I moved to Colorado, I did farm for a while.
On these
I mean,
slopes.
these slopes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Up by Eaton.
Okay.
But then I got out of that and then went on to working in construction, and I finished up till I retired in construction.
So more like your older brother Bill.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What have your younger brothers, the twins, what has been their work?
Lee drove for Meadow Gold for several years, and then after he
Mention about him getting out of the service. Gore.
Gore
getting him out of the
he did.
service.
Gore's there, Lee's father-in-law, Stephen helped him. He had passed away, then Lee came back and married Donnelly, then he farmed the Gore place for, what, 2 or 3 years? Before he went to work for Medigold.
And Mr. Gore passed away with cancer at an early age, 37 years of age.
Oh my goodness. But so he farmed for a while.
He
but
farmed there for a while, then he drove for Medigold for quite a few years. Then after he quit that job, then he went to work for the school district in Delta.
Mhm.
Dee was more in, he worked for the,
An automobile
Big parts,
place.
Yeah.
automotive parts.
but he had another job for
And
a while
electrical.
where he worked for that finance company in Delta
Oh,
for several
Whiteside.
years.
Whiteside.
oh, I
Yeah,
didn't know he
Whiteside.
did that.
Then after he got through with that, then he worked in the parts
And
house.
both their wives have worked in Delta all these years,
Yeah, all
too.
these years.
did any of the rest of you go to college after the service?
Just, I don't, Bill took that, like we said.
Under the
mechanics.
GI Bill,
Mhm.
they were, under the GI Bill, they could either go to college. I selected to go to college. Or they could take this farm training. They had some farm training going along with it, and on-the-job training.
Mm-hmm.
And they could qualify for those schools. They could get books, and they'd have so much schooling, and so forth there that they could get. So Bill did do that. And did you do some of that?
Yeah, I went to GI school.
Okay,
for a
so
while.
Dean took some of that schooling also.
I think maybe Lee and Dee might have done some of it too.
You want to go ahead with D?
Well, I think I covered Dee, didn't I?
Except that
Pretty much.
Except what he's doing, what he did, and what he's doing
now.
all the way through,
Well,
all the way through.
After he then he worked sold cars here for the last what? He worked as a salesman in the car business for several years now since he quit the parts business.
I would like to elaborate a little bit on D. D, after he left that Whiteside Financial Group in Delta, after he'd worked there, 3 or 4 or 5 years, he went to work for Hinton Automotive and Electrical. And that's one of the largest auto parts on the western slope of Colorado. And D worked himself up to a pretty good job in that work, and he was pretty well respected. And then they came through, and Mr. Hinton gave up the work, and a man by the name of King, Don King, took over the parts house, and D then, I had gone with him several times, and D took over the job of traveling up into Paonia and Hotchkiss and all around on taking orders on parts and everything, because he knew all those people, and it worked out real good. Actually, D was on that job for many, many years in that work, and it's just been here in the last 2 or 3 years, maybe 4 years, I guess, that he's been selling cars. And he sold for General Motors up at Montrose for about 2 years, and now he's been down in Delta for about 2 years, and that's what he's doing right now with General Motors down in Delta. And there's where D is right now, and Lee is going to retire here come in May. And Lee has worked for the school district 6, and he drove buses and was in charge of buses for several years. And then his last work has been the handicap bus that he's been driving. He has the ability to handle those handicapped children, and so he's going to retire. However, here come in May, I guess he will retire, and so he'll be leaving that work.
And both Donna Lee and Elsie have worked all these years too.
Now, Elsie, Dee's wife is Elsie Imhoff, and Dee was first married to a young lady that he divorced after he come right out of the service, and married this Imhoff young lady. And Elsie has had terrific ability in working in banks and so forth, and she's had a top job in handling finances and so forth, kind of like secretary for the president of the bank, and that kind of work, and she's been in that work for, I suppose, 40 years.
And how about Donna Lee? Doesn't she
And
have
Donna Lee has been in work actually in Delta there. She's been a secretary and
She worked at the bank several years.
Yeah, does she work in a lawyer's office now?
Yeah,
but
Not
it
till
isn't
somebody
a
told
lawyer.
me.
It's
It's not a lawyer.
It's a what do you call them? CPAs.
Oh,
CPA
okay.
work, and
Oh.
she does income tax work
Oh, I didn't know
and
that.
all of this kind of work there. And right now, she's having some trouble with arthritis, and it seems like that it's quite severe. So we're hoping that she will be able to whip that within the next few months, but at least get it in a condition where she can live with it. But anyway, Lee has had some heart problems. In the last 4 years, Lee had some heart trouble. He has been able to live with it and work with it, but he has had a little bit of heart trouble. Now, I'd like to finish up on my family. I married a young lady in Delta. Her name was Nancy Gano, and we were married in 1946 at the Episcopal Church in Delta. And of course, myself and she went to high school, so we were high school sweethearts. And so when we didn't have children when we were first married, so we adopted our first 2 children, Bill, our oldest boy, and Sally, our daughter. And so in about 2 years after we'd adopted them, why, here comes along our son Tom. So we had a planned family.
That's
There
right.
was there was Bill, who is, we'll say, 38 right now, and then our daughter Sally, who is 36, 2 years, see, between them. And then here comes old Tom along, and he's 34.
Oh,
So that's the way I talk about the fact. But it's worked out real good for us. The adoptions, we didn't try to keep it from the children or anything, and they accepted that, and it's been just real good. And our son Tom now is in Albuquerque, and he's in the roofing business, and he's an estimator now, and he came up through a group called Seaforth Roofing that's in the south, kind of a bigger group, and now he's with the head assessor's area of not assessor, estimating. Estimator. He's a head estimator now with an outfit down there in Albuquerque, and he likes it pretty well. But Bill is here in Greeley, and he works for the city of Greeley and is the water resource technician for the city of Greeley. One of the water resource technicians, and Bill is pretty good with drawings and blueprints, and he's real good with the reservoirs that Greeley has, and works real close with the professional engineer in charge, and so he's gotten along pretty good with that work. Sally is married to Gary Buffington, who came from Fort Collins, and he graduated from Colorado State University in parks, in the parks department. He's been a state parks manager now for, I guess 15 years, and they have 3 real wonderful grandchildren, and we go over there for games quite often, and Sally and Gary are both real good parents for those children.
And Tom also
has 3 children, and they, of course, Tom and his wife live in Albuquerque and his family. Okay, Evelyn, why don't you...
First, Don, did you mention that Bill, after Bill married Dorothy, that they moved to Mesa, Arizona? Well, fill that in
All right.
a little bit.
My brother Bill, just older than myself, we were only 16 months difference in our age, so we were always real close. And my brother Bill, of course, when he came back out of construction and all this type of work, he remarried his first wife, Eileen, and they moved to Cedar Edge, and he worked then over there with the honor camp. Was actually with your
was a prison system.
Prison system, and so he was working there, and then his wife Eileen got cancer, and she passed away, and had passed away there, well, I guess a couple of years, and he met a very nice lady by the name of Dortha. I thought I could remember.
It's Ackerman, isn't it? Ackerman, something
Ackerman
like that.
or something like that, and they had lived in the Delta area a long time. In fact, up near Austin, and I don't know what Bill would have ever done if he hadn't met this lady, because this is a fine lady, and Nancy and I would always go over there and visit, and we stayed with Bill because Bill always wanted us to stay with him. And so they lived up on a nice little place, about 10 acres, up there on near Austin. He had some red Angus cattle, and he had pasture and so forth. So then Bill got in trouble with Rocky Mountain fever from getting bit up on 25 Mesa at an honor camp up there. And so then he started having all those back problems and a lot of trouble with his back and his hip. And in fact, he thought he was going to just be unable to walk. It was so serious. Well, anyway, it got to be so serious that he suffered so much, he ate those pain pills just like I would this candy. And finally he said, I got to do something. So they finally decided then to move to Arizona, down at Mesa, Arizona. So about 2 years ago, Dorothy and him himself then moved down to Mesa, Arizona to get out of the colder climate. And it appears that he's getting along pretty good now down there, and that maybe he'll be able to enjoy life a little more. But Bill did suffer an awful lot. But he is better
And
now.
I don't even know how many grandchildren they have, but they have quite a large number of grandchildren. You
Yeah,
mentioned their
over
children.
on her side, too.
Yeah, they do that.
Good. You want to bring in your children's
Well,
list?
You go ahead and
All
take
right.
over now.
I left off when we moved to Meltonville, and Wayne was in the pastorate 9 years. And during that time, our 5 children were born. And then we moved out here to Colorado. We lived down at Goodrich a couple of years, and then we moved here to Greeley, and we've lived here in the Greeley area ever since, which is well over 30 years now. I don't know. I think it's going to get near 40 pretty soon. But anyway, we do have the 5 children. Richard is the oldest, and he and Terry live at Glenwood Springs. And he is a salesman for Cisco. Actually, he supervises salesmen at this point in time, but he has been a salesman. And they have 2 children. Julie lives over there and works in the area. She isn't married. Mark has finished his college education, and he lives in Denver and is a chemist for Geneva Drug in Broomfield. He's building a new house now. He's been married about a year and a half. Richard doesn't have any grandchildren at this point. Then Carol is next. Carol is not married. She's lived around the world, and at this point lives in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and she's worked for the government a great many years. Right now she works for the Bureau of Land Management, and we're happy to have her come see us when she can. Then next is Cheryl. Cheryl was married quite young, in 1967, in fact, the very year that my mother died. And they had 2 boys. One boy is married, and both the boys have gone to the Air Force Academy, and the older boy, Rod, has graduated from the Air Force Academy and has a master's through their programs as well, and he works for the Air Force yet and lives in Ohio. And the other boy's still in the Air Force Academy. Cheryl is an assistant superintendent of instruction at Hutchinson. She's finished her doctorate in education, and Ronnie works for the similar thing that Don's been telling about, Gary Buffington. He works for a recreation department and parks and so forth. Actually, he's a wild game biologist right now in that same department, but it's varied, some of the things he's done. Then David and Brenda and their family have lived in Europe for 20 years. They've lived in Vienna almost all that time, though they lived a little while in Italy, a little while in England, a little while in Germany, plus lots of other traveling. They're in missionary work for Operation Mobilization. They have 2 adopted older girls that were Brenda's sisters. Then they have 4 children of their own. Andrew, their oldest boy, died a year ago. And that leaves them with the 3 children. Joel is in college now at Marion, Indiana, and the 2 girls are still in high school in Vienna. And they don't know just what the future is going to be. They think about various things, but they're still living there in Vienna. And David is in missionary work that reaches out mostly at this point in Russia. Janet is married and has 3 daughters. She and her husband have been divorced about 2 years, but she still lives at Abilene, Kansas, and is a school teacher at the high school level there at Abilene, Kansas, and her oldest daughter is about to graduate from high school. So we have 5 children, and we had 13 grandchildren. Andrew's gone, so that leaves us 12. And Carla, David's one of his daughters, has a little daughter, so now we have a great-granddaughter as well. I guess that's about all the family. I can't think of anything else.
Why don't you mention that Mother passed away?
Yeah, okay. Our mother passed away in March 1967. It won't be very much longer now that will be the date, because it was the 10th of March when she died. Mark's birthday, our grandson Mark, is the 5th of March, and she knew when he was born because he was her first, great-grandchild, and she did know about that, but she died the 10th of March, 1967. And then Dad,
Feeling for Dad, Mary.
he married Edna Miller, that fall, and he died then in 1986 in June. A lot of those years they had happy years together and moved down to Eudora, Kansas, and seemed to have had a lot of happy times together, but both of their healths failed. And Dad actually was not well the last year or two, but up to that he'd been pretty well.
Lived into his 90th year, was
Yes, he was almost 91, and we had a big family celebration for his 90th birthday, and that was so nice that we were able to do that, I think. There was a lot of people who took part.
What made this probably quite impressive to us, to Dean and myself, was and Wayne, Evelyn's husband too, would be from the standpoint of at Dad's funeral, his body was brought back from Lawrence, Kansas to Delta, and my mother was buried in Delta, and so Dad was buried there too, and the sons and his grandsons were the pallbearers. So this was well, it was real pleasing to me. And another thing I guess I should mention while we're on it is that my mother, being the women's Sunday school teacher, and my dad also the teacher for the men in the church, they continued that work when we went to Delta, and we of course joined the Nazarene Church at Delta. And at Delta, then my mother was teacher of the ladies, and Dad was of the men. And so this was another part of that church work to give a little a little something probably to laugh about, but still be quite serious. Why, we had a minister at Delta by the name of Evans, Frank Evans, and he was quite active in his sermons. He was quite active, and he jumped up on that pulpit. I'll never forget one time, and he said something about compelling them to come in, and he brought that out, very forceful. And so another time, then he was on the part of getting bread, so Christ could feed the multitude, the fishes and the bread. And he was walking there, and Dad in his older age would kind of doze a little bit in sleep, a little up there, and he's always up there on the left side, about the second seat or the first seat. And so old Reverend Evans comes around there, and he said, "Give me some bread, Mr. Cockroft. Give me some bread." And that's and then when he see the preacher, Evans, smiled a little bit, and Dad says, "Amen."
He did that a lot.
Yes, he did.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
So that was another one of those amusing occasions, but it still was was quite meaningful.
Yeah, you might remember this, I remember when Uncle Glenn and Aunt Violet used to come over, Steph, Uncle Glenn always called Mom Trude.
Yeah, he did. I
He
forgot
always called her
about that.
Trude.
Uh-huh.
And him and Dad would be out somewhere, and they might get in a little bit late for dinner. Mom kind of get on him, and he'd kind of look at it and laugh. He'd say, "Oh, come on, Trude. Oh, come on, Trude." Well, in later years, Uncle Glenn and Aunt Violet and Mom and Dad took a lot of trips together.
Mm-hmm.
They went clear up into Glacier National Park and all over. I know
Great.
Mom really enjoyed that. I think she enjoyed those trips a lot. That was in their later years then, before
Yeah, before
after they
Mom
retired.
died.
Before
Yeah.
Mom died.
Once many years before she died, actually.
It was hard for her to get around, but she sure went. She said they were going to keep her from going.
She stayed home long
they
enough.
Went, and that was, that, I think probably Uncle Glenn and Aunt Violet kind of fixed that around so they could go, and they took, and the way they went. Of course, Dad wasn't a very good driver in those days,
Why, he finally didn't drive at
no,
all.
Because I remember a lot of times that he laughed that one time. Dad had a
Here's some more.
had a
Here's
Studebaker
this
pickup, and that thing had dents on both fenders and both rear fenders. Well, he'd go up to see Lee's or Dee's or something like that, visit the grandchildren, and And Donna Lee wouldn't let the kids ride with Dad. And she said, no, 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 no.
Well, Mom got so she's afraid to ride with him.
ride with it.
Because he wouldn't stop at the stop sign.
No, he just let it go.
And I'll never forget a trip that Dad and Mother took. One of the last trips that Mother was alive, and they had gone down to Arizona on a trip, and my mother had a great religious feeling for the Indians, missionary feeling toward the Indians. So they came through northeastern Arizona on the way back, and they stopped at one of those Indian places and looked over merchandise and so forth, and they got in the car and were going on. And they got up to a T in the road, and Dad says, I wonder which direction we should go. And so Mother didn't say anything right then. And so Dad went to the left, and they just turned to the left and started up the road, and Mother says, Ivan, stop. I just feel like we better go the other way. God's spoken. And she had that feeling. So they did. They went the other way. And she says, I don't know what kind of trouble we might have run into going the other way. But that would have taken them up through Durango, I think, or around that way. But this other way would take them around through Farmington. And so an Aztec and around that way to get to Durango. But she mentioned that, and it made quite an impression on me. And the other thing was back in Kansas, too. One time there, when Rolfus was the minister, why, we got up about 3 o'clock one morning, and Dad was pacing the floor. So he was having sharp pains in his side. He couldn't hardly stand it. I remember that. And so Mom got up then, and we were up, and he says, I think we better call in the minister. So Reverend Rolfus came, and Jenny and Ernest Bugby and Uncle Clarence and Aunt Lena and, I don't know, just several of the church people. And Dad was still in severe pain. And so Reverend Rolfus and his wife came and anointed his head with oil. And they prayed. And I'll bet you in 30 minutes, Dad had lost the pain and he was asleep in the bed. And I'll tell you, that really stuck with me.
Sure. The power of prayer.
Power of prayer and healing.
That's right.
That's healing right there.
That's right.
And my folks just really lived real close to God Almighty. And the power of prayer. I mean, if there was anything happened, came up, I can remember my mother, and my mother particularly saying, I think we better pray about it.
Good. What a rich heritage to have as a memory.
That's right.
Well, Don, you speaking about prayer, I don't think Dad ever made a decision or anything without praying.
Right.
And I know a lot of times, I remember when Dee and Lee and I were little, of course, we were hungry boys, and come to the table or something. And sometimes we thought he prayed a little bit long before we ate. We started getting a little hungry there.
And we always had family worship.
Yeah, oh yeah, every morning.
Either Dad or Mother would read the scripture in the Bible and have family worship, and every morning. And of course, in the later years, Dad always would get up around 5 o'clock, and he always would get the fires in the wintertime. I remember going good and everything. Then he'd pray for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then he'd come call us to get up to go do chores, and then he'd go out and do some other work. Now, he'd go out and feed, and he'd want us to get up and go do chores like milk the cows and so forth. But anyway, we always fed cattle and lambs, and a lot of lambs, and a few hogs. And we had about all the way from 6 head to 10 head of dairy cattle that we milked all the time. And of course, my mother had the chickens and that type thing too. But we always had quite a few livestock all the time. And Dad always felt like that well, he liked to feed those lambs because he made the expression one time. He says, "I never lost $1 on a lamb." And at that time, we had a market to California, but now over on the Delta area, your market is so far to market now, so it'd be tough to come
Not
out
as
on
good
now.
Well, you know, Uncle Mutt had sheep and lambs a lot too in those days.
But they had to ship them that far
They
away?
had to ship
Well,
to
all
Cal-
their markets were quite a ways away. It
That's
was
right.
for hogs too.
Yeah,
and
the lambs went to California. We had a great big old boy that'd come in there and buy those lambs, and he'd buy them all in that valley, and they'd ship to California. He had a big
There were
market.
sheep all over in that area that were raised, clear up in the hills even.
Yeah, they were
as
raised
well as
there.
cattle.
Did you eat any mutton?
No mutton,
No.
lamb.
Oh,
Don't
just the
call
lamb.
it mutton.
Okay, there's a difference.
But I don't.
Mutton's an old ewe,
It's the mature one.
mature,
Oh.
older ewe.
Okay.
And a lamb, lamb is just good a meat as anything else. In fact, it's finer texture meat and everything. A leg of lamb, if it's fixed and cooked like a woman can do, a good cook can do, you can't even hardly tell it, except it's a finer texture.
Did your mother serve some of that?
Oh yeah.
But I don't think as much.
Lamb
as
chops. No, we didn't eat so much lamb.
Uh-huh.
We'd always get in our feedlots. Dad would say, "Well, they're getting close," and that meant we'd need to get in there and sort them, and sort off the ones that are ready for market, and hold the others back another week to another 10 days to 2 weeks to finish them out. And Dad would say, "Well, now I hate to hold them another to next week because you know what happens." Now I knew what happened because we did that once, and boy, those bigger, fatter lambs started dying, and when they start dying and they're ready to go, boy, quite a few of them will die on you. So when they were about like that, boy, that's the lambs. When we'd find a lamb that was just standing there, and Dad could tell he was going to probably have some trouble living, why we'd butcher that booger. And but we didn't eat very much lamb. We ate just a little bit. And
Did you shear? Did you have shearing?
well, no.
Or not a lot? Not that much?
No, at that time we didn't shear the lambs. Wool was a good price. So you left the wool on the lambs. But now they shear all the wool off of those lambs that you see in the feedlots.
Yeah, I believe they do too.
Yeah, all of them.
Is that right?
But then the wool was a good price, so they wanted that wool left on there because that pelt off from that lamb would probably bring in as much as from $8 to $10 just the pelt itself with the wool. You see, now they don't manufacture anything hardly out of wool anymore, or at least a blend.
The synthetics have all taken over.
But that's the difference now we've gone through, see? Through that whole thing, and from fat animals to lean animals.
Yes. Very different.
Right. Well, you think we're going to run this
Yeah, I
down
think that's enough.
here? Maybe we've got a funny closing, have we?
Well, it's,
Or
of course, my children are Doug and Amy and Kathy, and Kathy and Amy are twins. Kathy lives in Greeley, and Amy lives in Alaska. She has a little daughter named Bailey. Kathy is a school teacher, and she has a little daughter by the name of Amelia. Then Doug lives in Pueblo, and he works for the Hartford as a boiler inspector and inspects welds and so forth. And he's done that for several years. Well, he has a daughter by the name of Tori and a son Zach, and they both go to school. They live with their mother and go to school at Bennett. Then the woman I married had 2 boys, and they live here in Greeley, and then their children also live here in Greeley. And then I don't know, I was going to tell maybe a little bit about, you remember the time that, I don't know if you was with us or Don, when we come home from Delta One, that's when we still lived on Ash Mesa. And Dad was driving, and it was Sunday night. You know, we used to turn off there at, was it Stage we turned off at?
Stage
to go
Meat,
to, up on Ash Mesa. And Mom and Dad in front and us kids were in the back about half asleep, and I know we were driving down through, and Dad missed the turnoff. He was sitting there about half asleep, and we started to say something, and Mom said, "Shh, just let him go, just let him go." So he didn't wake up for quite a while. We went we're on up around, and there was another road coming into the place up above. I remember that. She said, no, don't say that. Just let him drive.
She was pretty trusting.
Yeah. So he finally come to, oh, my land, I missed the turnoff.
How much time you have left?
Well, that's
Are you
ready?
ready?
Maybe I'll add a little bit more about my work. After I was married, I didn't teach at all for the 9 years that my husband was in the ministry. But then we came to Colorado again. We moved to down near Goodrich, and I taught at Goodrich 2 years. And then we moved up to Greeley, and I taught it all 26 years. It wasn't all in the classroom. Some of it was working with aides and in different kinds of government programs. But I took an early retirement at age 60 in 1980. And I've never been sorry I did that because we were able to travel a great deal. And we have made 5 or 6 trips to Europe. I don't know which it is. And we've gone to the Holy Land twice. And we've gone to Egypt. We've done lots of different kinds of traveling here in the United States. And that's wonderful to have done that. I also, I remember when I was married that I just prayed, Lord, please let me get my college degree before I die. And the Lord did allow that I was able to get, I had both a master's too as well, and a specialist, and even some hours toward a doctorate. And the Lord was good to me in being able to do that. But, like I said, I took retirement in 1980, so did Wayne, and we were just saying that the 3 of us are all retired now, and Bill's retired, and the boys mentioned earlier that Dee and Lee are about to retire, so I guess we are going to be the retired Cockrofts at this point.
Well, it's good we're getting some of this information from your years of experience.
I wanted to add to this just a little bit. You may have gathered through here that the 5 Cockroft boys are pretty proud of their sister Evelyn. And she always helped us out so much when Mother'd be gone or something, and Dad need a lady around the house to help a little bit. And if Evelyn was there, why, she'd prepare the meal and that kind of thing. And then she did, of course, go on and get her schooling. And she's actually had, how many years of teaching?
Well, it's actually 32 altogether.
Okay, so Evelyn's had 32 years of teaching, plus being a mother of a family there when times were tough. I'll tell you that. And she worked hard at being the mother of 5 children.
But the Lord gave me good health. I'm
And
always
so
thankful
she's
for
had
that.
good health and all this time, and has done a real good job with teaching and so forth. And so her retirement, of course, I'm happy for them because Wayne has Social Security and Evelyn has her PERA, which is our teacher retirement here for Colorado. And then she's able to draw some on Wayne's Social Security too. So it makes them enough
To live on.
To live on. And actually, I am real proud that Evelyn was able to go ahead and teach that long. She went ahead and got her master's and did some work on her doctorate. And she, of course, has had a real experience, and I'll have to brag on her just a little bit probably here, because she's probably, without question, one of the best teachers that ever taught in the United States of America.
I would agree.
In the United States of America. I want it to be known.
Good, I agree.
And she was, she's probably one of the best.
Maybe I better have something to hold my head down.
And then, of course, then I'll go back to myself a little bit.
Yes,
I
wanted
went to Colorado State University to school. At the time it was Colorado A&M in the fall of 1947. Instead of going in and helping Dad and joining him in the farming operation, I went ahead to school on the GI Bill, and I went 4 years at Colorado State University in vocational agriculture education, and came out of there, and I went out to LaPorte at high school at LaPorte for 1 year and taught vocational agriculture and had the FFA, of course, along with it for 1 year out there. A real fine experience, but it just wasn't an agricultural community. So the next year I moved over to Eaton, Colorado, and I was there for 12 years at Eaton, Colorado, and at Eaton, Colorado, I had real interested public citizens, farmers in the community, and I enjoyed working with those farmers and their sons, and a sort of a liaison between the school and these families, and particularly with their sons. And through the FFA in vocational agriculture education, we have an awards program and a development of leadership program with these students that you have in no other type of educational program. It's just terrific. And those students that had success, that's what measures the success of an ag teacher, when he can see the success of his students.
Right.
And then I was fortunate in '63 to get a fellowship back east to work for some work toward a master's degree, and that would then qualify me to become a state FFA executive secretary. And so I spent then a year back east with 3 other fellows from the United States in a program back east, Washington, D.C., and then we went to 1 day a week up at College Park, Maryland. And we worked on our master's degrees at that time there too. I came out of that program, went down to Arizona for a year in agriculture education in the State Department, traveled the state with the state officers in FFA, but my state supervisor, director, I could tell we weren't seeing eye to eye on everything, and he wouldn't let me have the FFA part of it to really do something with. And so I asked him, and he said, well, Don, you came here from Colorado, and we felt like that the job should have been offered to one of our own people in the state first. So I knew right there and then that, Don, you better get moving, that you unless you do, you may not last too long. So I came up to Fort Morgan then, and taught 14 years over at Fort Morgan in vocational
And Nancy
agriculture
taught some
education.
there, too.
And Nancy also taught there, and we had a fine experience there. We had the experience, of course, of I finished my master's degree while I was there and was able to go on there, and then we had 3 men in our vocational education department at Fort Morgan, and I just have to say that it was a pleasure in all my time through teaching, because I was in an area where you could see quick results of your students. And this really means a lot, because now you can see those students as you go back into those areas, and you can visit with them and those families, and it's just a wonderful experience to be able to do that, particularly after you retire.
Yes.
And so it just worked out real well for me, and Evelyn says it's worked out real well for her. So I can think of no other type of work, if people can handle the part of being a teacher, there's no greater satisfaction in any type of work than being a teacher. If at the present day it's tough because of the discipline situation.
Yes.
But if they can handle the situation, there's a great reward for being a teacher.
Have any of your children picked up this vocation?
Teaching, you mean?
No, not of Sally is probably the closest to it, because she's real heavy into this church work.
And working with children.
And working with children
Yeah.
and young people. She was, when they were in Denver, and Gary, her husband, was the manager out of Chatfield Reservoir, why the First Church of the Nazarene, which is one of the largest in the United States, really, she was the head young lady in the training and teaching department for their Sunday school and this type of work, and going around and study of the Bible and the like. They had classes, and they'd have the quizzing part about the Bible and all this kind of thing, and she would put on those schools for several of the churches over the eastern part of Colorado. And she enjoyed it very much. And now she's up at Fort Collins, and she she's finishing up work in college work in psychology.
Great.
Well,
And
you
of
know,
course
yeah,
yours-
my children have. Carol was a teacher 5 years, and then even in the supervisory types of work she's been in since, it has involved, various kinds of teaching. Cheryl is not in a classroom right now because I told you she's assistant superintendent, but she has been in various classrooms in junior and senior high leading up to that, and Janet is still working at the senior high level in regular classrooms. David also had a teaching degree and is interested in teaching. And actually, he works with training, young people and so.
I see how much of your mother's influence is still
Yeah, I
being
think
carried
so.
on.
Well,
Uh-huh.
you
In
were
that
talking
way.
about that. Now, Kathy taught.
Yeah,
She not only worked at
yeah,
the
he's
Rice
got a
Center,
daughter that's good
Kathy,
teaching.
and she teaches and has also helped the handicapped.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
She's
See?
doing that.
You're right.
Amy didn't go into teaching. She worked for the Bank of Alaska,
Uh-huh.
and she is the loan officer up there on
How
one of
often
the
do you get to
branches.
see her?
Amy? No, I have never been to Alaska. I'd like to go, but she's been here a couple, 3 times.
And she calls you.
Oh, yeah, she comes and sees us all the time when she's here.
Great.
And Kathy does too.
I imagine it's about time to finish up, so I want to take off on this thing of him going to Alaska. I think he'll be going pretty quick because he likes to fish, and he's a good fisherman. And so now with us both retired, last summer we spent a really enjoyable summer because we'd go fishing about once a week at least,
Great.
maybe twice. And so I'm afraid he's going to go on up there
Well,
and
that
take a
sounds
trip
pretty
I'd like
good.
and
to.
catch some of
I
those
wish you
big
could,
ones.
Dee.
You
Of
better
course,
go with
Don, the
him.
only thing I hope I haven't been invited yet.
Oh,
No, I would like to say something else about Evelyn. I remember Evelyn bought me my first bicycle. And she also,
remember that.
Why,
she
we have
also-
a picture. He showed me a picture of it the other day.
and she also helped furnish the house, as I remember.
Good.
She bought, I remember the piano
Well,
and the couch.
Oh,
and
the
a
couch. I
couch.
remember
Yeah.
the couch.
And- yeah, and that's when she was working up there making that whopping $45
Oh.
a
No,
month.
I was making 80 and 85 and 90 then. I was a little richer.
You was
wasn't I?
really in the chip.
Yeah, really.
She mentioned about Evelyn. I'll get it in a minute. I guess I'm getting a little old. But Evelyn had this job up there on Lamburn Mesa, up above Paonia, and so I had met my present wife, of course, Nancy, and we took Evelyn up there to that school on a
Yeah.
weekend
They
on
took me
Sunday
back.
afternoon, and she had to build a fire in the blooming school. And so I remember going up there, taking her up there, and I'll tell you what, we were in snow about that deep going on out there to that school, and I began to wonder if she should be going up there to teach school that week or not, but she got right in there and got that old fire built and going, and we got things kind of settled, and so then when my girlfriend Nancy and myself, we took off then and came back, but boy,
Those
I'll
were
tell
nice
you.
people up there, or I wouldn't have made it. They were very fine people. But we lived right up on the side of the mountain.
School teachers had to do so many things
Oh,
in those
yes.
days.
Had to keep up all that fire.
Let me ask you as a finale, what, as your children or grandchildren are watching this, what, from your retired experience, words of wisdom would you want to leave with them? Or what value system or things could you
One of the
remind
things
them?
I'm going to say, and I think it applies to lots of things, is that I think you need to have lots and lots of patience with all sorts of things. That seems like to me.
That's probably right.
That to me is true.
Okay. How about you boys?
Well, I don't know about, I'm sure Don thinks on the same line I do. You better take advantage of all that savings and stuff that you possibly can, because you can sure use it after
In
you're
your old
retired.
age.
Yeah.
Okay.
I believe that I would have to say, from the standpoint of our country, number one, recognize the importance and honor to God. And
I'm
Number-
sure we all agree on
number
that.
two, remember the importance of being parents in a family. And that includes advice and help and so forth to those children. Plus, remember religion. And don't sell it short. Because Christianity is really important. Now, I was listening to a sermon the other morning by a minister he was talking on the area of prayer. And he said, you know, this country could run without our senators, our representatives, our people there like that. He said if we as a country and us as the citizens of this country recognized the importance of God and gave him the first place, he said, hey, you know what? The President of the United States could run this country under God. One nation under God. And if we were doing God's will and asked for his direction and meditated and waited a little bit and for his will, instead of us coming in and saying we want it our way, this country could run without us.
Yes. And you see, our children and grandchildren aren't hearing this as much, but we as grandparents have an influence to these generations to come. So I appreciate your passing that expression along and reminding us.
But
You're gonna say something
Well, what
else?
I was just going to comment on what Don said, I think there's no doubt that if we all lived by the Bible, then we wouldn't have you wouldn't have any of these problems. If all of us did abide by the Bible, we wouldn't have all these problems.
So then I guess we better read it so we know what it says.
and understand it. But don't get in a hurry to understand it. Take some time and make sure that you take in all sides. You got to negotiation, understanding the other fellow a little bit too. You got to understand him. We got to work together this day and age. The world's getting smaller and smaller all the time, and so we've got to work together on these problems. And so, I guess that's as much as I had to say.
Well, I think you've all given us some good memories from your parents and family's viewpoint, and I know it'll be a treasure.